Hello, and welcome to this session on technology hosting solutions for KM systems in the cloud or on premises. I'm Frank Cervone, and I'm sorry I can't be with you today in Washington. I really wish I could, but unfortunately circumstances have prevented that from happening. So we've put together this video of my presentation, and while it's not as good as the real thing of me being there, it's a pretty good approximation. So let's get started. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the various options and issues related to on-premises versus cloud-based solutions for knowledge management systems. And so some of the things that we're going to look at are the drawbacks and the benefits of each option. And where we're going to put some particular focus is on security concerns and control issues. Because when moving to the cloud, one of the biggest concerns in many industries is related to how security and control over both the systems and the data is going to work. And the reality is that this is not necessarily straightforward, and it can be a fairly complex issue. So one of the questions that often comes up in relationship to on-premises or the cloud is which is better? And the reality is that that question really can't be answered without a lot of context. Neither solution is better in all cases. For many organizations, a cloud-based solution is going to provide the flexibility and the cost savings they need in order to deliver better services. However, for other organizations, cloud-based solutions may not be feasible at all, given regulatory and compliance issues that they must deal with. So when we look at cloud-based solutions, essentially what we're looking at are three variations of where for two dimensions of what. So when we talk about the where, we're talking about hybrid options, purely cloud-based options, or purely on-premises options. And when we're talking about the what, we're talking about the difference between just a storage solution as opposed to a software solution. And we're going to look at the different permutations of these. So the supposed benefits of on-premises are really predicated on the fact that this is what most IT folks still today are most familiar with and comfortable with. In an on-prem solution, you have your own servers and firewall that allow you to protect your software and data. Most folks who make an argument for an on-prem solution will say that it's more reliable and secure. The reality, however, is that this is not really always the case. The fact is that in many situations, a cloud-based solution is probably more secure simply because the cloud vendor has far more staff and expertise in implementing the various security aspects that need to be in place to protect both your software and data. Now, one true advantage of an on-premise solution is that software costs are mostly based on an upfront perpetual license fee. The advantage of this is that, to a great degree, you know what your upfront cost is going to be, and you also know what your maintenance is going to be, at least for some fixed term, usually 1 to 5 years. On the other hand, the company remains responsible and bears the cost for training, support, and updates. On-premises solutions provide control the cloud often cannot provide, because it offers the organization complete ownership and control of the software, the hardware, and the data. Now, the supposed benefits of the cloud are often touted. One of the most important being is that generally the system is hosted by somebody else. So you are able to take your in-house IT staff and use them more effectively for perhaps higher value issues. Cloud technology is based on virtual technology, which is hosted off-site. which means that for the most part, you don't have individual server hardware for every single instance of an application you may have. Instead, virtual machines, virtual hosting software is used to create a server environment that replicates a real-world, as they say, hard iron environment. One of the advantages of this is that you can set up that virtual environment so that you can instantly provision new servers as needed. We're going to come back to why this is an advantage in just a little bit. Now, another aspect of being hosted in the cloud is that there are typically no capital expenses, so there's no or low upfront investment required. However, the expense model shifts to an operational model, so you pay as you go with either a monthly or an annual subscription. Now, oftentimes, as opposed to the on-prem solution with a perpetual license, this operational expense model of pay-as-you-go covers ongoing training, support, and updates. But this isn't always the case, so you need to make sure that this is part of your contract. With a cloud solution, data can be backed up more regularly and in more flexible ways than is usually possible for an on-prem data center. And overall, a cloud-based solution offers greater flexibility and time savings. Oftentimes there may be money savings as well, but this isn't guaranteed. Now, when we talk about deployment, the deployment models between the two are very different. So on premises, the software and the hardware are deployed in-house, which means that you have to have in-house staff or contract a consulting firm to help you implement this. The system and the data then are completely located within the enterprise's IT infrastructure, and the organization is responsible for maintaining the solution, all of its related processes. So these are ongoing costs that the organization will have to bear. Now in the cloud, resources are hosted at the service provider, and the technical implementation is done by the vendor. So typically, all you have to do is focus on the application implementation in your organization. You don't need to worry about the hardware and software and getting that all set up for the most part, except for configuration issues that would be specific to your organization. Generally, with the cloud solution, you're able to get started more quickly because the cloud vendor has things set up so that they can easily implement a new client. The other advantage of the cloud solution is that usually it can quickly scale up if needed. So if after going live you determine that you need more computing power or more storage, it is typically much easier with a cloud-based solution to add additional storage or computing power than it would be with an on-premise solution. When we look at costs for on-premise solutions, these are typically capital expenditures, and so the organization is responsible for the ongoing cost of the server, for hardware, power consumption, and space. So there's not only just an initial layout, but then there's also the expense of the ongoing maintenance of all of these as well. However, since these are capital expenditures, typically there's more flexibility in being able to either move forward at an earlier stage if needed, or defer maintenance, which is really not a good idea in most cases, but the reality is that it happens all the time. With a cloud-based solution, however, the expenses are all shifted to operational expenses. So typically you pay a flat fee to start, and then you pay additional fees as you go based on usage. The maintenance and upkeep of the infrastructure is typically built into those costs, so it's not like you have to allocate additional funding in order to make that happen. And the price can adjust either down or up, depending upon how much is consumed. And this is one of the dangers of, or potential dangers, of a cloud-based solution, is that there's a certain unpredictability, potentially, to your costs. And since these are operational costs, it's not as if you can defer them to some point in the future if you don't happen to have the available funding at the time the bill is due. But another important aspect is related to control. And this is one of the arguments that is frequently made for an on-premise solution, is that the organization retains all of the data and control over what happens to it. Organizations in highly regulated industries with extra privacy concerns are more likely to gravitate to this approach because, again, it's familiar, but it is also the case that if we have control over the data and the systems, we probably have better insight into what is actually happening. Now, with the cloud, the question of ownership of data is open to debate, and this is one of the major concerns for some organizations related to cloud solutions, is that there have been a number of cases where the ownership of the actual data of an organization has been disputed as to who actually is the owner. The organization getting services from the cloud provider or the cloud provider themselves. And of course, depending upon where one is, the jurisdictions and the decisions that are made aren't necessarily consistent. But an additional concern is that both the data and the encryption keys reside with the third-party provider and typically do not reside with the organization itself. So the downside to this is that it potentially exposes the organization to more risk if something unexpected happens. And this then leads into a number of issues related to security. So as we already said, with an on-premise solution, the responsibility and control rests with the organization. This typically means that there is a larger in-house security team required, and depending upon the industry, cloud options may not adequately address regulatory concerns. So in some cases, you may not have a choice but to have your systems on-prem. Now, in the cloud, security is a shared responsibility, and this is perhaps one of the biggest misconceptions that some people have, is that security is provided by the cloud vendor. One of the other issues to think about, breaches in the cloud are often more publicized than breaches in on-prem systems. Now, the issue with many of these cloud breaches is that the nuances of these are more complex and in reality rest more often with the organization using the cloud vendor as opposed to the service that the cloud vendor is actually providing. And we'll come back to this. But again, one of the significant concerns is the potential loss of intellectual property because the data is no longer hosted locally and is subject to whatever may happen at the third-party vendor. Related to security is compliance. So in many industries, there are various regulatory control functions that need to be in place. For example, FISMA, HIPAA, FERPA. Organizations that are subject to these regulations oftentimes must know where their data is at all times. With a cloud-based solution, it really requires due diligence on the part of the party contracting with the cloud vendor, because the party contracting with the cloud vendor has to ensure that that vendor is compliant with all regulatory mandates. For example, sensitive data often must be secured and located in appropriate jurisdictions. There are restrictions in US law that prohibit data from being stored in certain other nations. Similarly, Canada has a requirement that many data items cannot be stored in the United States because of the Patriot Act. And then finally, of course, customers, partners, and employees must have their privacy ensured. So we need to make sure that our cloud vendor has the facilities in place that can alleviate any concerns that any of these constituent groups may have. So oftentimes a hybrid approach will be taken, which utilizes both the cloud and on-prem solutions. Now, which is used depends on the specific need. So for example, something that I'm familiar with and that we implemented on several of our systems is that we used in-house servers for the most important data, but then we did backups into the cloud to both facilitate access and to use advanced functionality. So we were able to do different types of backups in the cloud. This also helped us address some of the recovery and business continuity issues that we had if our local systems and data center were to become unavailable. So some of the advantages that a hybrid solution can offer include flexible scalability. So when the capabilities of your on-prem solution are exceeded, you can use the cloud to instantly scale capacity. On the other side, when demand decreases, you can scale down. So for example, if there are particular times of the year when you have significantly more activity for whatever reason, a hybrid solution can allow you to scale up as needed, but then when that demand goes away, you can then reduce your costs by not having as many virtual servers, for example, running. The cost savings associated with not having to purchase, install, and maintain redundant and just-in-case servers at your facility to account for these variabilities in demand can be significant. In addition, a hybrid solution gives you a level of agility that just isn't possible with a completely on-premise solution. And it provides greater interoperability potentially with other applications that may exist either in the cloud or on premises, but also from the perspective of distributing your applications so that you can improve performance in a distributed environment. If your organization has offices all over the world, and some of those offices, for whatever reason, have difficulty with connectivity back to your corporate headquarters, a hybrid cloud solution could help address that by allowing your systems to be hosted more locally to those offices, potentially eliminating some of the network issues that may exist in trying to get back all the way to your corporate headquarters. Then, in the background, the data can be consolidated at a time and place when it's most convenient for your systems, rather than having to delay the work of individuals in remote locations simply because network connectivity is impeded. But hybrid isn't a panacea. There are obviously security concerns. And now you have two environments that you have, at least two, that you have to manage. It's possible, quite likely, that you will have higher operational costs because you have at least two environments to maintain. And there's going to be more internal responsibility within your organization because the hybrid model requires both internal and external management of systems. And this includes issues related to the data center, software, hardware, and particularly security and compliance. So let's focus now on some of the things that I think are probably most important when you consider whether a cloud solution is best for you or not. The primary concern, especially given my background, is related to cloud security and understanding the context of the environment, and in particular, what do you need to manage and what will the vendor manage? And this is really important Because, for example, there are some large providers of cloud-based services that will allow you to create servers all over the place. But the reality is that their level of security that they are going to provide is related to that container level. So making sure that the issues of access to the server itself is fairly secure within the constraints of your contract. You are generally responsible for the security of the applications within that container. If we have an AWS or a Microsoft Azure virtual server, AWS and Microsoft will ensure that there's some level of security related to the overall server construct, but what's within that server and the security related to that is completely up to you. And the reality is that the vast majority, like almost all, security incidents that occur in cloud-based systems are a result of some sort of misconfiguration that the client has done because they don't understand the different security environment that cloud systems run in. Oftentimes, this is because directory services work differently in the cloud than they do on-prem. So, for example, Microsoft Azure AD is not really exactly the same as Microsoft on-prem. And so you'll have to work through the issues. So you'll need to ensure that those two systems are coordinated so that you don't inadvertently create some sort of security exposure. The other thing that you need to ensure is that if you do have regulatory compliance concerns, that you have a legal review of your contract or agreement to ensure that all of those concerns are going to be met. So, for example, in the health environment, you need to ensure, if you're going to have patient data up in the cloud, that your vendor is going to be compliant with all of the HIPAA regulations. Just because the data is hosted on another vendor's site doesn't relieve you of the obligation to ensure that they are doing the correct things. So this is where a SOC 2 certification audit comes into play. So without going into too much detail, a SOC 2 audit ensures that your cloud solution provider is adhering to best practices related to security. The first thing that you should do is ask your vendor to provide their latest SOC 2 certification audit. If they cannot provide this, I would recommend that you walk away, because if they can't provide this, there is no way that they can assure the security of the systems and the data that they're going to be hosting. Now, just because they passed the SOC 2 certification audit doesn't necessarily mean that they are not going to have an issue. But this is one of those cases where if they can't at least provide this level of evidence, you know that they probably are not operating at the level you as an organization need in order to be confident and secure your data and systems are protected. Now, going back again to where the risk really is, according to a recent Gartner study, at least through 2025, it is likely that 99% of cloud security failures are going to be the customer's fault rather than the vendor's fault. And through 2025, at least 90% of the organizations that fail to control public cloud use will inappropriately share sensitive data. Put another way, this means that you have to get your distributed IT, your rogue IT, under control so that they are not using cloud-based services inappropriately. So some other cloud software potential concerns that you should think about are the long-term costs. because a subscription model can end up costing more in total than an on-prem perpetual license. This is especially true if you do not regularly update software. The model that's used in cloud-based software is that the vendor will provide, either on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis, regular updates to the software. In general, those software updates are rolled out to customers regardless of their situational readiness to accept the change. So this creates some issues internally. It means that internally you have to be much more agile to adapt to changes in the software that may occur. If you don't and you choose to not update, you need to ensure A, that the cloud vendor will even allow you to do that. But if they do, what are the costs going to be? Because the reality is that cloud vendors make their money off of bulk services. And if they have to run multiple versions of software to accommodate you, you're probably going to get charged for that. In addition, you also need to understand that cloud-based software has less flexibility than software you may run on premises. That is because usually the only options you have are the options that are already built in. All of the organizations that are using that application are using the same off-the-shelf application, and the services are typically designed for an industry and not a specific organization. In my experience in implementing cloud-based software, this was it was the biggest issue related to implementing the software, because it really required the organization to change the way it thought and did certain things, because the way we were doing things were based on a legacy of homegrown systems that started 20 years ago. And the fact of the matter is that the world really doesn't operate that way anymore. And so either we had to adapt, or we would have to negotiate with the vendor to make changes that would accommodate our specific work processes. And in some cases, A, this wasn't really in the vendor's strategic interest to do, but B, it would cost so much in order to do it, it really wasn't feasible. So it's just something to consider, is that there's potentially less flexibility. And then finally, the security concerns. Cloud-based software should integrate into your single sign-on and multi-factor authentication schemes that you're using. You don't want a system that has its own authentication scheme off to the side. And that's because the onboarding and offboarding of access to those systems should, really must, in my opinion, be integrated to your organization's directory server, whether that's LDAP or Active Directory, what have you. You can't have a lot of disparate systems with their own security schemes if you're going to have an environment that is going to be secure. So some things to consider. Be aware of the political issues that you may run across in trying to migrate to the cloud. So one issue that you may have are what are called the server huggers. And these are folks who are convinced that an on-premise solution is the best solution because it is visible in front of them and they can touch and feel the systems that they're using. Another thing is that you need to ensure that the responsibilities of what your vendor is responsible for and what you are responsible for are clearly outlined, and that you've considered the risks related to that division of responsibilities. You also need to make sure that there are organization-wide policies that are enforceable related to how cloud storage should be used, what are the responsibilities of the departments who are using cloud-based storage are, as well as what the consequences of violating the policy are. As mentioned earlier, you need to make sure that you bring shadow IT under control, because this is the area where you are most likely going to run into issues with breaches in how your cloud-based solutions are being used. Organizationally, you also need to make sure that there are policies in place that formalize the approval processes for external cloud services. So you don't want to leave this decision up to each individual unit, particularly if you are in a regulated industry. That is just totally unacceptable. You have to have standard policies across the organization in order to ensure that you minimize your risk as much as possible. The other thing you need to make sure is that your cloud and on-premise access management are in sync. So you need to ensure in a number of different ways that the access policies that you provide both to data and systems are equivalent regardless of whether the systems are located in the cloud or on premises. It's very easy, particularly if you have to work with two different types of authentication systems, for those policies to become askew. The other thing that you need to make sure is that you regularly test your systems, your controls, and your vendor. So you should get regular updates from the vendor on what they are doing in relationship to the software that they're hosting for you or the services that they're providing in order to host your data, as well as what their status is in relationship to security compliance. One final thing to think about is that when you move to the cloud, it becomes more likely that you will be subject to vendor lock-in. Once you've migrated your data to a cloud system, it is far more difficult to migrate that data out in many cases than it is with an on-premise solution. And this is because simply you don't have the same sort of level of access to the systems and data in order to get the data out. Now, generally, this is less of an issue if you're just looking at a storage-only solution. However, there are possibilities that if you select some esoteric data storage solution offered by a vendor, that it may be difficult to get that data out and into a different format at a future time. Where vendor lock-in most often happens is with applications, in that typically the applications tend to be proprietary solutions, oftentimes, although the vendor really won't tell you this, the reality is that they're designed to keep you as a customer, which of course makes sense from their perspective. So going into any contract negotiation, you really need to think about what the migration strategies are. The reality is that who knows how long a vendor may be in business. And even if the vendor is in business, their strategy may change and they may decide that they don't want to support this system anymore, either purchase or develop some other system that they want to migrate people to, but maybe that system isn't appropriate for you. So you need to make sure up front that there are viable migration strategies to get out of a vendor cloud solution. In summary, though, the cloud is the future of computing, whether you like it or not. We see that in the evolution of a number of things, such as the Power BI client. Really, Microsoft is pushing everybody to Azure Power BI. We see that with SharePoint, which used to be a solely on-prem solution, and now really Microsoft is pushing everybody to SharePoint 365. You see it with Cognos and IBM, where they're really pushing folks from the local client to using Cognos BI. So thanks for watching this presentation, and just make sure you get what you're expecting. So when someone delivers something to you, you don't end up in a situation where you're expecting mint ice cream, but you end up with broccoli ice cream. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my email, fcervone@cervone.com.